Welcome to Pressure Point. I'm Marilou Carillo. Our discussion will be on yet another issue of women's rights. However, the issue of when a woman is harassed by her landlord is a silent, sinister, and dangerous one. With us to reflect and discuss this issue are Chris McDowell of the YWCA Vancouver Housing Registry and Deborah Gordon-Romero of the Tenants Rights Housing Coalition.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Why is this important to be here to talk about this?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say first off that I'm really glad to be on cable television, and we tried to get media attention drawn to the issue of the harassment of women tenants, and found it very difficult to get mainstream media attention. The Vancouver Sun, which I would have loved to have done a story, just insisted on having a lot of women come forward with their stories, which is such a difficult thing to do that we couldn't get enough women to come forward to get the Sun interested. So cable television has been where we've turned to and gotten the response, as you can see tonight.
So what does TRAC do, the Tenants Rights?
Okay, what we do, well, specifically around this issue, is we operate what we call our hotline, which is where tenants can call in with problems they have between them and their landlords or their housing situation. And we've received, just since we've been tracking numbers, which hasn't been that long, we've received over 1,300 calls from women who've been harassed or sexually harassed by their landlord or their management.
So what actually happens when a woman calls you and says, my landlord has entered my apartment?
Right. It's a good question. First thing we do is listen to her story, because often it'll be the woman will not necessarily call us around that specific issue. She'll call us around a repair issue or a rent increase, and then after talking with her, this will come up because she doesn't, a number of reasons which we can talk about later, but she doesn't feel that that's the primary issue for her because societal pressure, because she doesn't want to lose her housing. What we try to do then is, with the little that we have legally, is try and direct her to the right places so she can do something about it if she so chooses, as well as immediate action to protect herself against any type of physical abuse she may suffer under her landlord or her manager, housing manager.
And a common story would be a woman is at home, or?
Well, a common story, they really vary. There's for example, a woman called me whose landlord had come in while she was showering. Another woman, her landlord had come in while she was in bed. Illegal entry, quote, when a landlord just walks into the place thinking that it's his, where you pay a lot of rent and you're paying his mortgage, but landlords have a right to a key to your home. And
so that's legal, that the landlord has a key.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
it's legal that the landlord has a key.
But the entry is illegal?
On paper it is.
Oh, yeah.
On paper.
And so what does the paper say? I mean, if this is an illegal act?
Well, what the law says is that the landlord, in order to enter into your home, because that's what it is, it's your home, you're paying for it, is they have to have a minimum of 24 hours written notice before coming into your apartment, so you can prepare yourself whether you choose to be there or not be there, or for whatever you need to do. However, as Chris mentioned, it's on paper because landlords, it says in the Residential Tenancy Act, which is the law that deals with landlord tenancy issues, that the landlord can be fined up to $2,000 if they come into your home without their written permission asking.
But no fine has ever been levied. So this is just, you know, this is a nice thing on paper. It's never once been levied.
So there's illegal entry as something that's on the paper.
Yeah,
it's
but
in the
useless
books.
at this point, as far as we can tell.
But there's also sexual harassment. Is that the same thing? Are we talking about the same thing when we talk about the sexual harassment of women in apartments?
It can be. For example, I mean, Chris gave 2 stories of women who are in their apartments. There's also issues of perhaps more sinister, not perhaps as physically dangerous, but for example, I got a call a little while ago of a woman who she would come home and her underwear had been taken out of her dresser drawers and was hung around the apartment on the bathroom door, hanging over a wall hanging. So this woman has to come home and know that the landlord has been coming to her apartment and going through her underwear and wondering what's coming next, apart from all the other feelings she must be feeling. So that's, to us, considered sexual harassment, as well as what Chris was mentioning, where the landlord just walks into your apartment. And there is, in the Residential Tenancy Act, there is nothing that deals with that. Within the law that deals with landlord-tenants issues, there is something in human rights law. Maybe Chris wants to talk about it a little more.
Yeah. It took me a while to find out, but the Human Rights Act does give women limited protection against sexual harassment by landlords or property managers or their agents, like whoever it is. Like a real estate agent might be an agent of the landlords. So the Human Rights Act covers discrimination on the basis of gender, okay, in a tenancy situation, which means that if it's explicitly sexual harassment, then there's some hope that the Human Rights Council will help a woman. Now, it's not a big hope, but it's something that we want to explore more. For me, it's new that I've discovered that there is this option for women, although it's been around a long time. And part of why a lot of us didn't know about it, because I interviewed lawyers and everything before I found out about this, was because 90% of the cases that go through the council don't go to a public hearing. They get settled out before the hearing, and the landlord will pay extra money and get a gag order, so that a woman who's gone through this process of bringing the landlord to the human rights and actually got validation and help from them, then gets her $1,000 but can't go to the media. So, I mean, have you heard stories in the media? I haven't heard stories in the media. I didn't know that this was available for us.
So which has more clout? Is for a woman to go through the human rights, sexual harassment route, or to go through the illegal entry route? Because this is pretty frightening.
To go through the Residential Tenancy Act, through the Residential Tenancy Branch, which is the government office that's set up to deal with these issues, a woman tenant can't really do anything, because one, she needs to get the proof, and often women, anybody is harassed, but particularly women, when they are alone, so there are no witnesses. Even if there are witnesses around, the Residential Tenancy Branch will say they don't have the jurisdiction to levy the $2,000 fine that's written in the law. So then we took this to the law courts, the Attorney General, and they said, well, we don't touch this issue because it's dealt with at the Residential Tenancy Branch. So there's nowhere to go with it, because the courts are saying, we can't touch this, it's not ours. The Residential Tenancy Branch is saying, we can't levy fines.
We don't
and
have
the woman
that power.
is left not being able to go anywhere.
Not protected.
So what's being done then?
Well, you see, the thing is that the way it works legally is it breaks down into all these different things. There's sexual harassment, has to be clearly sexual harassment.
Right.
Illegal entry isn't clearly sexual harassment.
That's right.
Okay? So that has to be dealt with by the Residential Tenancy Act, which doesn't. The Residential Tenancy Branch doesn't. So there's this limited protection through human rights, that if you're considered a good case, there is some potential there, and we want to encourage women to try and push the limits there.
Definitely.
You know, to try and get things happening. And I really resent the idea of the gag orders. I think this is it doesn't deter landlords. We're not publicly hearing that they're paying these fines. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, yes. So again, that's where the silence comes.
Right.
So if a woman has had her landlord come into her apartment, and imagining how she must feel, what would you suggest that she do?
First thing I would suggest she did is contact one of us or our organizations, because we do have experience with this, and we can, if it is an issue where they think it's sexual harassment, and it's got a fairly broad definition, then we can direct them towards the Human Rights Council, because as Chris said, we really do want to direct women in that towards the Human Rights Council, because I think the more it comes up as an issue, the more they're going to have to deal with it, and the more likely we are that women are going to be able to resolve it through the Human Rights Act. If it's an issue of illegal entry, we are trying very hard to have the issue of illegal entry and the $2,000 fine enforced within the Residential Tenancy Act, and we're doing some pressure to make. It hasn't happened yet, but we're working to make it happen.
We also want personal harassment added to the Residential Tenancy Act.
What about some practical things that a woman could do?
Yeah, well, that's where we are.
Be creative.
That's where we are. Be creative. You know, be assertive. Take assertiveness training, or ask for tips on assertiveness. Chain locks for protected while you're in there.
something that was going through my mind.
Yeah,
which
women.
is, you know, having somebody, knowing somebody out there has a key, knowing that they can come in, and knowing that there's this long process to resolve
no
that.
kidding. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
how much is a chain lock?
Yeah.
Right. No,
Well,
it
it's
doesn't.
a legal change that I think, and Deborah and I both agree about this, that would be great, is a tenant-only key policy, where only the tenant has the key.
So that would mean
right
a
away there you're
change-
cutting down
There
the
would be a change to the
possibility
law.
of all kinds of problems.
a change to the law would be left to organizations fighting for the rights of women in this case, or what can the women themselves do?
Well, we're working in a coalition with other organizations.
It's
and
just started.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
can contact us.
So it's important that women call you,
Definitely. Definitely.
tell you what's going on, and so that
Yeah.
there's the data,
Yeah.
and there's the
But also
mandate.
to think over whether or not they want to be public. Do they want
Yeah.
to be public in the media,
Yes.
alternate media, or
Yes.
mainstream media?
Which
That's
they don't
important.
have to be to work with us as a choice. We can head them in that direction if they're interested in being
Yeah.
public, or they
Yeah.
can work in other ways with us.
So what are the consequences for women who don't do anything about this? What?
Yeah, it's a very important. It's very important to look at this in a bigger context of tenant issues, because the problem is if a woman, if the landlord is coming in and harassing you, or continues to come into your apartment, or you know they're coming while you're out, it's true we need to be assertive. The problem with that is that there is very little protection for the woman around the issues of losing her apartment. Now, if there's a
Yes.
woman who has 2 kids and she's got an apartment that's a reasonable rent, and if she goes and tries to do something to stop her landlord from coming into her apartment, what happens if next week, when the rent increase time comes up, he doubles her rent? Or if he refuses to do repair issues, he refuses to repair her stove or to fix her toilet or her leaky roof, because she's confronting him about the
Yeah.
issue of harassment.
It's hard for women. A lot of women put
very-
up with it for reasons like what she's talking about.
So unless we have other protections, for example, rent control, so women don't have to face that risk of having their rent doubled, and other security of tenure issues put into the law, it makes it very difficult for women to deal with the issue.
And of course, the psychological effects are also something we can't put down in the books.
But that's
what
just it. It's really
does that
terrible
do?
because this is your
Yeah.
home. This is your home. You're vulnerable in your home. You know, and it's such a violation, and that needs to be considered. Like, the police are not very responsive in these kinds of issues, and it's like they don't get it, how violating this is and how dangerous it feels.
Right.
And
it can
again,
be.
it extends yet another situation where women have to tolerate
Exactly.
the oppression. It is an
Exactly.
oppression because the person with the key and runs the apartment building is the person with the
the building
power and
manager.
the right.
And your home is the place where you come from the ugly outside world, and you come to your home where you want to feel at home and feel comfortable, and not even there can women feel safe and secure.
Thank you very much, Chris
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Deborah.
Thank you.
When your landlord harasses you, there are some things you can do. Telephoning the Vancouver Housing Registry and the Tenants Rights Action Coalition. Thank you. Welcome back to Pressure Point. Our guest is Judy Graves of the City of Vancouver Housing Relocation. Welcome, Judy. Housing the Spirit is an intriguing name. Can you say more about that?
Well, Eva and I chose the name because I experience finding housing for people as a spiritual journey. It's often started in a very dark place, and it can take a very long time and a number of transitions.
So your work has to do with assisting people in finding housing, such as a person who would be the kind of person that would need your assistance.
Oh, tonight I wanted to talk specifically about persons with AIDS. And I could tell you about one young man, very early 20s, who contacted me from a downtown East Side shelter some months ago. He had grown up in a series of foster homes. He'd been in Browndale, had been through every kind of adolescent correctional facility there was, and had graduated to working the street as a very, very young adult. He was HIV positive, and the means of transmission could have been blood transfusion. It could have been from an intravenous drug use. It could have been from a homosexual encounter in the prostitute district, or it could have been with a young woman who was his lover. We'll never know. He had called me because he'd been living outside and kept getting evicted from the shelters because of his emotional problems. Over the course of time, while I was trying to find him housing, it was very difficult to find housing for this man.
Why was that?
Well, because when I would find housing, I couldn't find him because he was living outside. And when I could find him, I couldn't find housing that was suitable or affordable, or where he would be accepted. Over the period of time, he shared with me that he was spending the shelter portion of his welfare check to keep his furniture in storage. And he acquired a very large, beautiful, gentle dog. And the dog became sort of a focus for his affection and his tenderness, and brought to life a part of him that nobody'd seen before. And the furniture had tremendous meaning for him, because this was his way of saying that at one point in his life he'd managed to attain an apartment and that he wanted to do it again.
So what were the problems in finding housing for him?
Well, part of the problem was that he had only $325 a month to spend on shelter. And in Vancouver, that will rent a tiny bug-infested room in a downtown East Side hotel. He would have had to give up the furniture, and he would have had to give up the dog. And these were the only sources of meaning in his life. And I couldn't really persuade him to do that.
So when you talk about a spiritual journey coming from a dark place, so for this young man, the dark place would have been his illness, and so his journey begins. So the metaphor is the journey he takes with you or on his own.
Yes.
Into finding a home, a physical home, that would also house his person.
That's right. Moving from homelessness to a place, a real home. Moving from complete isolation into community. Moving from destitute poverty to enough to house and clothe and feed himself and his dog.
Now, you've mentioned to me that something different about this population is that they are young. Our communities are familiar with the problems of housing and the elderly, or housing.
But all of a sudden we're housing a group of people who will never be elderly, who may live another 10 years, or 2 years, or 15 years, or 3 years, and we never know. We don't know from one day or 1 month to the next.
And they are young.
Very young.
And our societies, our communities are not accustomed.
Not anymore. 100 years ago, it was not unusual for people to die in their childhood or their teens or their early 20s, but no one with a living memory has experienced that. We've all expected our children to reach adulthood strong and healthy, and to grow up and have their own children strong and healthy, and to live into their 80s and 90s. And suddenly, for a large group of people, this is not happening.
And because of these expectations, our health care, our housing care, our housing policies are catered around these people who will reach old age.
That's right. And the buildings that we have for single, disabled, and elderly people are not suitable for the very young. It's not a population that will mix easily with the very elderly, has different expectations and different needs.
So moving from a young person moving from a healthy situation where they have their own lives, their own apartments, and fit into the expectation of society, suddenly they move into a totally different kind of community if they do get housing.
Exactly. Often I'll see a person who has even a master's degree, has been paying off their student loans, has got their first apartment of their own, and suddenly finds themselves with AIDS.
And poverty then?
Sudden poverty, sudden destitute poverty, and no real future. A desire to continue to work, and an illness that will leave them unable to work half the time. There may be persons in their early 40s to late 50s who've established a career, but one in which they had not planned for a future, expecting to be able to live long and healthy, the way we all grew up, and are suddenly impoverished.
And so, yet in your work, the structures we have continue to address sort of our old expectations and
the expectations that we've developed during this century. Although traditionally the church has always housed people, especially people for whom their illness was a metaphor for sin. And I think
such as
leprosy, tuberculosis, the plague.
Right, so there's a system that the church got into.
There's a system that has been with the church from the beginning of the church, which temporarily has not been as needed. We've focused as a church on housing our elderly, and it's time again to looking after our disabled young.
Is this true of other religions as well? Because our cities are now very multicultural. Would the other religions have this tradition as well of housing the people who are ill?
There are persons within all cultural groups now who are beginning to work towards making sure that everyone is cared for.
So the churches had a traditional role with the people who are ill. So now we have this new situation of young people who are ill. Are you saying that the church will then continue with their traditional role with the young people who are ill?
I'm hoping that as a church we'll continue in a very ancient and necessary tradition.
And but do they have the means? I mean, churches. How can we move churches to look in this direction?
Churches have resources. First of all, educational and political resources. The possibility of teaching people what's needed, the possibility of educating people towards considering the substantial need for social housing, especially in urban environments, when they're casting their votes. The church develops subsidized housing now, and there's a possibility of designating some of the units for persons with AIDS. The church is also land rich.
Which means?
That there's a possibility of building in church parking lots, in building on church land, housing that would be suitable for young persons with disabilities, for a broad range of disabilities.
And educating and making people aware about this change in our health demographics, in a sense, is truly important, because then people don't have to say, well, what are those young people doing getting subsidized housing? You know,
That's
I can sort of
right.
see some of those attitudes if people fail to understand that things have shifted.
That things have
particularly
shifted,
because of
and
AIDS.
in some ways this has brought to light an existing problem, that there are large numbers of young persons who become disabled by multiple sclerosis, by arthritis that's not responding to treatment, by mental illness, who have terrible housing needs and who live perpetually in crisis.
So the spiritual journey of this young man that you started out talking about, where did his spiritual journey go? Did his spirit become housed?
We are on the journey, and we will continue on the journey. The young man and his dog are now in an apartment with his furniture. He's very happy about this, although there's so little money left over after he's paid rent and dog food that he can barely feed himself. So our next part of the journey is to bring him further into community, to try to move him closer to subsidized housing.
And moving him further into community means his own interactions with other people?
Interactions with other people, finding the ways to meet his needs, establishing contact within his family, just continuing to be with him as we move him closer and closer to what would be a good situation for him.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Marilou.
Thank you for joining us on Pressure Point.
The preceding program was produced through the facilities of Rogers Community 4, Vancouver. We want to hear from you and invite you to leave your comments and suggestions on our 24-hour response line message machine. Please call 731-5812.